She thought the worst thing that could happen was losing everything she owned to a crooked gambler. But when Judge Cornelius Blackwood sentenced her to walk barefoot through 50 miles of razor-sharp cactus desert for a crime she didn't commit, Faith Sterling learned that some punishments are designed not to teach lessons, but to ensure silence forever. The sun hammered down on Perdition Flats like the devil's own anvil, turning the Arizona Territory into a furnace that could cook a man's soul right out of his body. Faith Sterling stood in the wooden dock of Judge Blackwood's makeshift courtroom, sweat beading on her forehead despite the early morning hour, watching as the corrupt magistrate shuffled through papers that would determine whether she lived or died. The courthouse was nothing more than a converted saloon in the mining town of Bitter Creek, complete with whiskey stains on the floor and bullet holes in the walls from Saturday night disputes. Judge Cornelius Blackwood, a man whose jowls shook when he spoke and whose eyes held the cold calculation of a rattlesnake, had been bought and paid for by every wealthy mine owner, cattle baron, and railroad magnate within 100 miles.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Faith had arrived in Bitter Creek 3 months ago with nothing but a worn leather satchel, a few coins, and a burning desire to start fresh after her husband's death back in Kansas. She'd taken work at the Silver Dollar Saloon, not as one of the painted ladies who worked the upstairs rooms, but as a bookkeeper and occasional seamstress, mending torn dresses and keeping track of the establishment's finances. The owner, a gruff but decent man named Murphy O'Connell, had appreciated her quick mind for numbers and her steady hand with a needle. For the first time since Thomas died, Faith had felt something approaching peace. She'd rented a small room above the general store, attended the modest church on Sundays, and even begun to imagine a future where the shadows of her past couldn't reach her. But peace was a luxury that men like Judge Blackwood couldn't afford to let honest people keep. Faith's downfall had begun 2 weeks ago, when she'd accidentally discovered a discrepancy in the saloon's books that wasn't Murphy's doing. Someone had been skimming money from the Silver Dollar's accounts, but not just pocket change. Substantial sums were being diverted to something called the Desert Development Company, a shell corporation that existed only on paper but had somehow purchased thousands of acres of seemingly worthless desert land. Faith's experience keeping books for her late husband's grain business had taught her to recognize patterns, and this pattern stank of fraud. When she'd mentioned her concerns to Murphy, he'd gone pale and told her to keep her observations to herself. Murphy's fear should have been Faith's warning, but she'd always been too curious for her own good. A few discreet inquiries around town revealed that the Desert Development Company was connected to Judge Blackwood, Sheriff Randall Crockett, and 3 of the wealthiest men in the territory: railroad magnate Harrison Blackthorne, cattle baron Augustus Grimm, and mine owner Salis Forge. These 4 men had been systematically buying up worthless desert land for pennies on the dollar, land that just happened to sit directly in the path of the proposed transcontinental railroad extension. When the railroad came through, that worthless sand would become worth more than gold. Faith's mistake had been trusting the wrong person with her suspicions. She'd approached Reverend Samuel Hoskins, thinking the man of God would know how to handle such corruption. Instead, Reverend Hoskins had gone straight to Judge Blackwood, who'd moved swiftly to eliminate the threat. Within 24 hours, Faith found herself arrested on charges of theft, embezzlement, and disturbing the peace. The evidence against her had been manufactured with impressive speed. Forged receipts showing she'd stolen money from the saloon. Witness statements from people she'd never met claiming she'd been acting suspiciously, and testimony from Reverend Hoskins himself stating that she'd confessed to criminal activity during what she'd believed was a confidential conversation. The trial, if it could be called that, had lasted exactly 37 minutes. Faith had been denied legal representation, prevented from calling witnesses in her defense, and forbidden from examining the evidence against her. Judge Blackwood had listened to the prosecution's case with the rapt attention of a man hearing Scripture, then dismissed Faith's attempts to defend herself with the wave of a pudgy hand. The verdict had been predetermined, guilty on all charges. But it was the sentence that revealed the true depths of Blackwood's cruelty. Faith Sterling, Judge Blackwood had intoned in his gravelly voice, you stand convicted of theft, embezzlement, and disturbing the peace of this lawful community. In consideration of your crimes and your status as an outsider who has brought discord to our peaceful town, this court sentences you to walk barefoot through the Cactus Flats to the settlement of Redemption Springs, a distance of approximately 50 miles. You will carry no water, no food, and no shoes. Should you complete this journey alive, your debt to society will be considered paid. Should you perish in the attempt, your fate will serve as a warning to others who might consider similar criminal behavior. The courtroom had erupted in nervous murmurs. Even in a territory where justice was often rough and arbitrary, Blackwood's sentence was shocking in its calculated cruelty. The Cactus Flats were a wasteland of barrel cacti, prickly pear, and jumping cholla that could strip flesh from bone. The razor-sharp spines would slice through shoe leather, let alone bare feet. No one had ever attempted to cross the flats on foot and lived to tell about it. The judge was sentencing Faith to one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable, and doing it under the banner of legal justice. Sheriff Crockett, a lean man with cold gray eyes and a mustache that twitched when he was nervous, had escorted Faith from the courtroom to the edge of town. A small crowd had gathered to watch the spectacle, some horrified, others grimly fascinated. Murphy O'Connell had tried to intervene, offering to pay any fine or restitution, but Judge Blackwood had ruled that the sentence was final and non-negotiable. Faith had been forced to remove her boots and stockings while the assembled crowd watched. Then Sheriff Crockett had pointed toward the shimmering expanse of the Cactus Flats, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Redemption Springs is that way, he'd said, gesturing northwest toward a range of purple mountains that seemed impossibly distant. 50 miles as the crow flies, maybe 60 if you follow the safer paths. There's an old mining trail that runs through the worst of it, marked with stone cairns. Follow those, and you might make it. Stray from the path and the desert will swallow you whole. You've got maybe 6 hours before the real heat of the day sets in. I'd start walking if I were you. Faith had stood at the edge of the desert, barefoot on the rocky ground, feeling the first sharp stones bite into her solace. The Cactus Flats stretched before her like a green and brown ocean of thorns, broken only by the occasional towering saguaro cactus standing sentinel in the distance. The morning sun was already fierce, promising a day of brutal heat that would suck the moisture from her body and leave her delirious with thirst. She'd looked back once at the town of Bitter Creek, seeing the faces of people she'd thought were neighbors and friends, then turned toward the desert and taken her first step into hell. The initial pain was almost manageable. The ground near town was mostly hard-packed dirt and scattered pebbles, rough but not impossible to navigate. Faith had walked perhaps half a mile before she encountered her first patch of jumping cholla, those deceptively innocent-looking cacti whose segments would detach at the slightest touch and embed themselves in anything soft enough to penetrate. She'd tried to step carefully around them, but the desert seemed designed to funnel travelers directly into the most dangerous areas. Within minutes, she had 3 cholla segments stuck to her skirt and one embedded in her ankle, its barbed spines sending waves of fire up her leg. Removing the cholla segments without proper tools was an exercise in agony. Faith had torn strips from her petticoat to use as makeshift gloves, gripping the cactus pieces and yanking them free with quick, sharp motions that sent fresh spikes of pain through her body. The spines left behind continued to burn and itch, and she knew they'd fester if she survived long enough for infection to set in. But stopping to deal with every spine would mean certain death, so she'd gritted her teeth and continued walking, leaving a trail of blood drops on the rocky ground behind her. By the time she'd walked 5 miles, Faith's feet were shredded.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Hamburger. The soles had been punctured by dozens of thorns, cacti spines, and sharp rocks. Every step sent lightning bolts of agony up her legs, and she'd begun to walk with a distinctive shuffle, trying to minimize the pressure on the worst wounds. The sun was climbing higher, and the temperature was rising toward the murderous levels. That made the Cactus Flats infamous. She'd already begun to feel the first symptoms of dehydration, dry mouth, dizziness, and a peculiar floating sensation that made the horizon shimmer like water. The stone cairns that Sheriff Crockett had mentioned proved to be Faith's salvation and torment in equal measure. The old mining trail they marked did indeed provide the safest passage through the worst concentrations of cacti, but safest was a relative term in a landscape designed to kill the unwary. The trail wound between towering barrel cacti whose massive trunks bristled with 4-inch spines, past forests of prickly pear that grew in impenetrable walls, and through narrow passages, where jumping cholla hung overhead like green chandeliers of death. Faith learned to read the desert's moods, recognizing which plants were merely dangerous and which were actively malevolent. As the sun reached its zenith, Faith encountered her first mirage. She'd been walking for 7 hours when she saw what appeared to be a crystal-clear spring bubbling up from between a cluster of rocks. The vision was so vivid she could hear the water gurgling and feel the cool mist on her face. She'd stumbled toward it with desperate urgency, only to find empty sand and another cluster of barrel cacti. The mirage had been so convincing that she'd wasted precious energy and time chasing an illusion, leaving her even more depleted and disoriented. It was during her recovery from this cruel deception that Faith first heard the sound that would either save her life or herald her death, the rhythmic thunder of horse hooves approaching at full gallop. In her heat-addled state, she first assumed it was another mirage, perhaps conjured by her desperate need for rescue. But the sound grew louder and more distinct, accompanied by the jingle of metal and the creak of leather. Someone was riding hard across the desert, moving with purpose and speed that suggested intimate knowledge of the terrain. Faith tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a croak. Her throat was so parched that swallowing felt like trying to force down broken glass. She waved her arms instead, using the torn remnants of her petticoat as a makeshift flag, praying that whoever was approaching would see her before riding past. The hoofbeats grew closer, and she could make out the silhouette of a horse and rider cresting a small rise about a quarter-mile away. The rider sat straight in the saddle with the easy grace of someone born to horseback, and even at that distance, Faith could tell this was no ordinary traveler. The horse was a magnificent paint stallion, its coat a striking pattern of white and deep brown that seemed to shift and flow in the desert heat. But it was the rider who captured Faith's attention, and held it with magnetic force. Tall and lean, with long black hair that streamed behind like a war banner, the approaching figure rode bareback with only a simple rope halter for control. This was no cowboy or prospector, but someone who belonged to the desert in a way that white settlers never could. As the rider drew closer, Faith could make out more details: bronze skin weathered by sun and wind, clothing that was a mixture of traditional native dress and practical frontier wear, and most importantly, a calm competence that spoke of someone completely at home in this hostile environment. The rider pulled up about 20 feet away, the paint stallion dancing nervously as it scented the blood and fear that surrounded Faith. For a long moment, neither human spoke. Faith found herself looking into dark eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries, eyes that took in her condition with a single comprehensive glance and immediately understood the full scope of her predicament. There was no surprise in those eyes, no shock at finding a half-dead white woman stumbling through the Cactus Flats. This person had seen cruelty before and knew exactly what Faith was fleeing. "You are the woman they sent to die in the thorns," the rider said in accented, but clear English. The voice was strong and sure, carrying easily across the desert air despite its moderate volume. "I am Tokala of the Modoc people. I have been watching the town of Bitter Creek, waiting for Judge Blackwood to reveal his true nature. Today, he has shown the world what kind of man he truly is." Faith tried to respond, but only managed a weak gesture toward the distant mountains. Tokala dismounted in one fluid motion, producing a water skin from among the various items tied to the horse's makeshift saddle. The water was warm, but tasted like ambrosia to Faith's parched throat. She drank greedily, feeling strength flow back into her limbs with each swallow. "Slowly," Tokala cautioned, gently pulling the water skin away after Faith had consumed about half its contents. "Too much too fast will make you sick. We have time now. You are under my protection, and no man in this desert is foolish enough to challenge a Modoc hunter on his own ground." As feeling returned to Faith's body, along with proper hydration, she began to take stock of her rescuer. Tokala appeared to be in his early 30s, with the kind of lean, hard-muscled build that came from a lifetime of physical challenges. His clothing was practical and well-made. Deerskin leggings, a cotton shirt that had seen better days, and a leather vest decorated with intricate beadwork that told stories Faith couldn't read, but somehow understood. Most impressive were his weapons: a rifle that looked military in origin, a bone-handled knife that had clearly seen hard use, and a war club that hung from his belt like a casual afterthought. "Why?" Faith managed to croak, her voice still. "Barely functional. Why help me?" Tokala's expression grew grave as he knelt to examine her wounded feet. His touch was gentle but clinical, the hands of someone accustomed to treating injuries in the field. "Because Judge Blackwood's corruption has poisoned this land for too long. Because innocent people deserve justice, not the kind of justice that sends a woman to die in agony for discovering the truth. And because my people have learned that sometimes helping one person can change the fate of many." As Tokala worked to clean and bandage Faith's feet using supplies from his saddlebags, she began to understand that her rescue was not the random act of kindness she'd first assumed. This was a calculated intervention by someone who had been planning and preparing for exactly this moment. Tokala had been watching Bitter Creek, studying the patterns of corruption, waiting for the right opportunity to act. Faith's persecution had provided that opportunity, but she was beginning to suspect that her rescue was only the first move in a much larger game. Tokala's skilled hands worked with practiced efficiency as he treated Faith's wounded feet, applying a salve made from desert plants that immediately began to numb the burning pain. The mixture smelled of sage and something else Faith couldn't identify, but its cooling effect was almost miraculous. As he wrapped her feet in strips of soft leather, she noticed that his fingers bore old scars, the kind that came from handling weapons and living hard in unforgiving country. These weren't the soft hands of someone who lived an easy life, but the calloused palms of a warrior who had earned his place in this harsh landscape through blood and struggle. "This will hold until we reach safety," Tokala said as he secured the makeshift bandages. "But you cannot walk far on these wounds. We must move quickly before Judge Blackwood realizes his plan has failed." He helped Faith to her feet, steadying her as she tested her weight on the treated injuries. The pain was still there, but muted enough that she could function. "There is a place in the mountains where we can speak freely. My horse can carry us both, but the journey will be rough." Faith looked back toward Bitter Creek, now invisible. Beyond the shimmering heat waves that rose from the desert floor, "They'll come after us, won't they? Blackwood can't afford to let me live now that I know about the railroad land scheme." She turned to study Tokala's face, searching for answers. In those dark, intelligent eyes. "But you already knew that, didn't you? This wasn't a chance encounter. You've been planning this." A slight smile played at the corners of Tokala's mouth, the first sign of humor she'd seen from him, You are observant, Faith Sterling. That is why you discovered what others missed, and why you are so dangerous to men like Blackwood. He moved to his horse, checking the various items secured to its back with rawhide straps. Yes, I have been watching the corruption in Bitter Creek for many months. My people have interests in this territory that go beyond what white settlers understand. The railroad brings change, and change can be either opportunity or catastrophe. As Tokala helped Faith mount the paint stallion, she felt the powerful muscles of the animal beneath her and marveled at the trust between horse and rider. The stallion stood perfectly still, despite carrying an unfamiliar passenger, responding to subtle pressure from Tokala's legs rather than reins or bit. This was a partnership forged through years of shared danger, not the typical relationship between a man and his mount. Faith found herself wondering what battles this horse had seen, what enemies it had outrun, what secrets it had helped its rider keep. They rode northwest toward the mountains, following game trails that were invisible to Faith but seemed as clear as highways to Tokala. The paint stallion moved with surprising smoothness across the broken ground, its hooves finding secure footing on rocks that would have sent a lesser horse tumbling. Tokala rode behind Faith, one arm around her waist to keep her steady, and she could feel the coiled strength in his lean frame. This was a man who lived by his reflexes, who survived because he could move faster and think quicker than his enemies. "Tell me about the Desert Development Company," Tokala said as they climbed toward the foothills. "What exactly did you discover in those books?" His voice carried a note of urgency that made Faith realize her knowledge was more valuable than she'd understood. Every detail could matter. These men have been planning something for a long time, and they will kill anyone who threatens their scheme. Faith found it easier to talk while riding, the rhythm of the horse's movement somehow loosening the knots of fear in her chest. It started with small discrepancies in Murphy's books. Money being diverted to pay for land purchases, but the land was supposedly worthless desert. Then I started checking courthouse records and found that the Desert Development Company had bought over 12,000 acres in the past 18 months, all of it along a specific corridor running northwest to southeast. She paused, remembering the pattern that had emerged from the dry legal documents. The purchases were timed to coincide with rumors about the railroad extension. Someone knew exactly where the tracks would run before the route was officially announced. Tokala's arm tightened slightly around her waist, and she felt his body tense. 12,000 acres. That is enough land to control the entire route through this part of the territory. They could charge whatever they wanted for right-of-way, demand partnerships with the railroad company, even build their own towns along the line. His voice carried a note of admiration for the scope of the scheme. This is not simple greed. This is an attempt to control the future of the entire region. As they climbed higher into the foothills, Faith began to see the Cactus Flats from a new perspective. What had seemed like endless wasteland from ground level revealed itself as a carefully organized landscape when viewed from above. The desert wasn't empty at all, but filled with subtle signs of life and movement. She could see animal trails threading between the cacti, patches of green that indicated underground water, and in the distance, the smoke of what might be Indian fires rising in thin columns against the blue sky. This was Tokala's world, and she was beginning to understand why he moved through it with such confidence. The railroad brings more than just trains, Tokala continued as they approached a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountainside. It brings settlers, soldiers, and the kind of change that destroys old ways forever. My people have survived Spanish colonizers, Mexican rule, and now American expansion. But the railroad is different. It makes distance disappear and brings the full weight of white civilization to every corner of the territory. Faith felt a chill despite the desert heat as she began to understand the larger implications of what she'd stumbled into. The land grab isn't just about money, is it? It's about controlling who gets to live here when the railroad comes through. Blackwood and his partners want to decide what kind of towns get built, what kind of people are welcome, what happens to the native tribes who are already here. The canyon Tokala led them into was a hidden sanctuary that Faith would never have found on her own. High walls provided shade and protection from the wind, while a small spring bubbled up from the rocks to form a clear pool surrounded by green vegetation. Ancient pictographs covered the canyon walls, telling stories and symbols that spoke of hunting, warfare, and spiritual journeys. This was clearly a sacred place, somewhere the Modoc people had come for generations to find water and shelter in. The hostile desert. Tokala helped Faith dismount near the spring, then began to unpack supplies from his horse with practiced efficiency. She watched him work, noting the careful way he arranged everything for quick departure if necessary. This was a man who never truly relaxed, who always kept one eye on the escape routes and one hand near his weapons. "You're not just a hunter, are you?" she asked as he built a small, smokeless fire. "This feels more like a military operation." "I am what my people need me to be," Tokala replied, setting a small pot of water to boil over the flames. "Sometimes that means hunting deer to feed the tribe. Sometimes it means scouting enemy movements. And sometimes it means rescuing foolish white women who stumble into matters too large for them to handle alone." The slight smile returned to his face, taking the sting out of his words. "You showed courage in that desert, Faith Sterling. Many would have given up and died. But courage without wisdom is just another way to get killed." As Faith soaked her feet in the cool spring water, she felt the last of the cactus spines working their way out of her flesh. The relief was enormous, but she knew the respite was temporary. "They'll track us here, won't they?" "Blackwood has Sheriff Crockett and probably other men who know this country. Crockett knows the main trails and the obvious water sources," Tokala said dismissively. "But this canyon has been hidden from white eyes for 300 years. The Spanish never found it, the Mexicans never found it, and the Americans will not find it unless someone leads them here directly." He poured hot water over a mixture of herbs, creating a tea that smelled of pine and earth. "Drink this. It will restore your strength and help your body heal." Faith accepted the steaming cup gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma before taking a careful sip. The tea was bitter, but warming, spreading heat through her exhausted body like liquid sunlight. "You've done this before, haven't you? Rescued people, I mean. Hidden them from enemies." She studied his face over the rim of the cup. "Who are you really, Tokala? And why are you risking your life for a stranger?" For a long moment, Tokala stared into the fire, and Faith thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and carefully controlled anger. 2 years ago, my sister Iana was working as a translator for the Indian agency in Flagstaff. She discovered that the agent was selling supplies meant for reservation families, leaving children to starve while he profited from their misery. When she reported this to the territorial authorities, they accused her of theft and sentenced her to prison. She died in that prison, Faith Sterling. Died for trying to protect her people from the same kind of corruption you discovered in Bitter Creek. Faith felt her heart sink as she began to understand the personal dimension of Tokala's mission. "I'm sorry. I can't imagine what that must have felt like, to lose family to such injustice. The agent who killed my sister still works for the government," Tokala continued, his voice growing harder. "The officials who ignored her testimony still hold their positions. Nothing changed except that one brave woman was silenced forever." He looked up from the fire, meeting Faith's eyes with an intensity that made her shiver. "I swore on Iana's grave that I would not let such corruption go unpunished again. When I learned of Blackwood's land scheme and saw how he dealt with anyone who threatened it, I knew this was my chance to honor that promise." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Faith's mind. "You've been planning this for months, haven't you? Watching, gathering information, waiting for the right moment to strike. My trial wasn't just corruption, it was opportunity. Blackwood revealed his true nature in front of witnesses, showed the whole town what kind of man he really is. Exactly, Tokala said with satisfaction. A judge who sentences a woman to die in agony for discovering fraud has revealed himself as a monster. Even his supporters will have trouble defending such cruelty. But we need more than public opinion to destroy him. We need evidence that even corrupt officials cannot ignore. Faith set down her empty cup and looked around the hidden canyon, feeling a strange mixture of safety and foreboding. The books I saw were just the beginning, weren't they? There must be contracts, correspondence, maybe even maps showing exactly where the railroad will run. If we could get our hands on that kind of evidence, it would destroy not just Blackwood, but his entire network, Tokala finished. Harrison Blackthorne, Augustus Grimm, Silas Forge, all of them. Their land scheme would collapse, their political influence would evaporate, and justice might finally be possible. He stood and began to pace the small clearing, energy radiating from his lean frame. But such evidence will be heavily guarded. These men know they are vulnerable and will have taken precautions. Murphy O'Connell might help us, Faith said suddenly. He was terrified when I showed him what I'd found. But that was fear for his safety, not guilt. I think he's been forced to cooperate, not willingly participating. If we could convince him that we have a real chance of success, Tokala nodded thoughtfully. A man on the inside would be valuable, but approaching him would be dangerous. For all of us. Blackwood will be watching everyone who had contact with you, waiting for someone to make a mistake. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Faith. Are you prepared for what comes next? This will not be a simple matter of gathering evidence and presenting it to honest authorities. These men will fight to protect their investment, and they will not hesitate to kill anyone who threatens them. Faith thought of Judge Blackwood's cold eyes as he sentenced her to die in the desert, of Sheriff Crockett's casual cruelty as he pointed her toward the Cactus Flats, of all the innocent people who would suffer if the corruption continued unchecked. Your sister died fighting for justice, she said quietly. My husband died fighting for what he believed was right, even though it cost him everything. I won't dishonor their memory by backing down now. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the canyon, 3 sharp cracks that reverberated off the stone walls like thunder. Tokala was moving before the echo faded, dousing the fire and gathering their supplies with lightning speed. They found our trail sooner than I expected, he said grimly. We must leave immediately. The sacred places of my people will not protect us from bullets. Faith struggled to her feet, testing her weight on the bandaged wounds. The pain was manageable, but she knew she couldn't run far or fast. How many do you think could we make? A stand here, against Sheriff Crockett and his deputies? Perhaps. But if Blackwood has hired professional gunmen, this canyon could become our tomb. Tokala was already leading his horse toward a narrow path that climbed the canyon's far wall. There is another way out, but it requires climbing. Can you manage with your injuries? More gunfire, closer this time, followed by the sound of horses moving through the rocks below. Faith realized that their pursuers had found the canyon entrance and were methodically searching every hiding place. I can manage, she said, gritting her teeth against the pain in her feet. Lead the way. As they began the treacherous climb up the hidden trail, Faith heard voices echoing from the canyon floor behind them. Sheriff Crockett's nasal twang was unmistakable, along with at least 2 other men she didn't recognize. Their conversation drifted up the stone walls with startling clarity. Track goes cold here, one of the strangers said. Could have gone upstream or down, or maybe climbed out somewhere. Tokala knows every hiding place in these mountains, Crockett replied with grudging respect. We'll need to spread out, check every canyon and cave. Judge wants this finished before word gets back to the territorial authorities. Faith and Tokala froze on the narrow ledge, pressed against the canyon wall as the voices continued below. The implications of Crockett's words sent a chill through Faith's blood. If Blackwood was worried about territorial authorities, it meant her accusations had already reached sympathetic ears. Someone outside Bitter Creek was taking her claims seriously. The climb up the canyon wall tested every muscle in Faith's battered body, but Tokala's sure guidance and the adrenaline of pursuit kept her moving despite the fire in her wounded feet. The ancient trail had been carved into the rock face generations ago, worn smooth by countless Modoc warriors who had used this escape route to evade Spanish soldiers, Mexican cavalry, and American patrols. Each handhold and footstep had been placed with deliberate precision, creating a path that was invisible from below, but perfectly navigable for those who knew its secrets. Faith marveled at the engineering skill of people whom white settlers dismissed as primitive savages. As they reached the canyon rim, the voices of their pursuers faded to distant murmurs that echoed off the stone walls like the whispers of ghosts. Tokala helped Faith over the final ledge, then immediately moved to a concealed observation point where he could watch the canyon floor through a gap in the rocks. His movements were fluid and silent, betraying military training that went far beyond simple hunting skills. Faith realized she was looking at someone who had fought in real battles, not just skirmishes with wild animals or cattle rustlers. They brought more men than I expected, Tokala murmured, studying the scene below through a small brass telescope that he produced from somewhere in his clothing. Sheriff Crockett has 4 deputies with him, plus 2 men I do not recognize, professional gunmen by their equipment and bearing. Judge Blackwood is taking no chances this time. Faith crept closer to the observation point, staying low as Tokala had taught her. Even from their elevated position, she could make out the tiny figures of armed men spreading through the canyon like ants searching for crumbs. How did they track us so quickly? I thought you said this place was hidden. It is hidden from casual discovery, Tokala replied, his voice grim with new understanding. But someone guided them here. Someone who knows Modoc paths and sacred places. He lowered the telescope and turned to face Faith, his dark eyes burning with controlled fury. We have been betrayed by one of my own people, the implications hit Faith like a physical blow. If Tokala couldn't trust his own allies, then their situation was far more desperate than she'd realized. Who would do such a thing? And why? Money, Tokala said simply. Or threats against family members. Blackwood is skilled at finding pressure points and exploiting them. He collapsed the telescope and secured it in his vest, then began moving away from the canyon rim with purposeful strides. There is a man named Joseph Crowfeather who has been drinking too much in the white settlements lately. He owes gambling debts to Harrison Blackthorne and has a wife and 3 children living near the reservation. Such a man might be convinced to trade information for promises of protection or debt forgiveness. As they picked their way across the rocky plateau that crowned the mountain, Faith found herself impressed once again by Tokala's knowledge of human nature. He understood corruption not as an abstract concept, but as a practical reality that could be analyzed and countered. If you're right about this Crowfeather, then Blackwood knows about other hiding places too. We can't just keep running from cave to cave. No, Tokala agreed, pausing to check their back trail for signs of pursuit. The time for hiding is ending. We must move to the attack before our enemies complete their preparations. He pointed toward a distant peak that rose like a jagged tooth against the azure sky. There is a place where my people gather when the old ways must be remembered. If the tribal council will listen to our story, we may find allies who are not so easily bought. The journey to the sacred mountain took them through terrain that seemed designed to test Faith's resolve. They crossed wind-scoured ridges where a single misstep would mean a 1,000-foot fall, threaded their way through forests of stunted pine where every shadow might conceal an ambush, and forded ice-cold streams that ran red with mineral deposits. From the ancient volcanic peaks, Tokala's paint stallion carried them both with tireless endurance. But Faith could feel the animals' breathing grow labored as they climbed toward elevations where the air grew thin and precious. As the sun reached its zenith, they encountered the first sign that they were approaching something significant. A series of stone markers appeared along the trail, each one carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in Faith's peripheral vision. Tokala dismounted and approached each marker with reverent attention, touching the carved symbols and speaking words in the Modoc language that sounded like prayers or invocations. Faith realized she was witnessing rituals that had been performed on this mountain for centuries before the first white man set foot in the territory. What do the symbols mean? Faith asked as Tokala completed his observances at the final marker. She had dismounted as well, partly from respect for the obvious sanctity of the place, and partly because her legs needed relief from the constant pressure of riding. They feel important, like they're trying to tell me something. They mark the boundaries of the council ground, Tokala explained, remounting and helping Faith settle behind him again. Beyond this point, no violence may be done by any person against any other, regardless of tribe or nationality. The symbols tell the story of the great peace that was made here when the mountains were young, when all the peoples of this land agreed to settle their disputes with words rather than weapons, as they crested the final ridge before the council ground. Faith gasped at the vista that spread before them. A natural amphitheater had been carved into the mountainside by some ancient geological cataclysm, creating a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by towering cliffs that blocked the wind and concentrated sound like a vast outdoor cathedral. The floor of the amphitheater was covered with soft grass that grew nowhere else at this elevation, fed by a spring that bubbled up from the center of the space to form a perfectly circular pool. Around the pool, arranged in concentric circles, were hundreds of stone seats that had been carved directly from the living rock, but it was the people gathered in those stone seats that truly took Faith's breath away. Representatives from at least a dozen different tribes had assembled for what was clearly a formal council session. She could identify Modoc, Klamath, and Paiute warriors by their distinctive clothing and weapons, but there were others whose tribal affiliations were unknown to her. All of them sat in perfect silence, their attention focused on a central area, where an ancient woman was speaking in a voice that carried clearly across the amphitheater despite its gentle tone. Tokala guided his horse down a winding path that led to the amphitheater floor, moving slowly and openly to announce their peaceful intentions. As they approached the outer ring of seated warriors, Faith felt hundreds of eyes examining her with varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and calculation. She was almost certainly the first white woman ever to set foot in this sacred place, and her presence here represented either a remarkable honor or a dangerous breach of protocol. The Pekonde, ancient woman who had been speaking when they arrived, was clearly the leader of this gathering. Her snow-white hair was braided with eagle feathers and colored beads that caught the sunlight like tiny jewels, and her weathered face held the kind of wisdom that comes only from surviving 8 or 9 decades of hardship and struggle. When she gestured for Tokala to approach the center of the amphitheater, he dismounted immediately and helped Faith down with gentle hands. "Grandmother Spider Weaver," Tokala said, using English for Faith's benefit while making a deep bow that spoke of profound respect. "I bring grave news from the valley settlements, and a witness whose testimony may change the fate of all our peoples." He straightened and gestured toward Faith. "This is Faith Sterling, who has discovered a plot by white criminals to steal the path of the Iron Horse and use it to drive us from our ancestral lands." Grandmother Spider Weaver studied Faith with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Let the white woman speak for herself, grandson. If her words are true, we will know. If they are false, the sacred ground will reject them. And us along with them." Faith felt the weight of hundreds of stares as she stepped forward, acutely aware that her torn dress, bandaged feet, and general dishevelment made her look more like a refugee than a credible witness. But when she opened her mouth to speak, the words came with surprising clarity and force. "Honored grandmother, I stand before you as someone who has seen the face of evil wearing the mask of law. Judge Cornelius Blackwood and his partners have conspired to steal thousands of acres of tribal land by manipulating the route of the Transcontinental Railroad. They plan to force your people onto smaller and smaller reservations, while they profit from the destruction of your way of life." A murmur ran through the assembled warriors, some angry, others skeptical. Grandmother Spider-Weaver raised one gnarled hand for silence, her gaze never leaving Faith's face. "These are serious accusations, White Daughter. Do you have proof of these crimes? Or do you speak only from wounded pride and the desire for revenge?" "I have documented evidence," Faith replied, reaching into the torn remains of her jacket to produce the folded papers she had salvaged from the Silver Dollar Saloon. Financial records showing payments to the Desert Development Company, property deeds for land purchases along the railroad corridor, and correspondence between Judge Blackwood and railroad officials discussing the deliberate displacement of tribal populations. She held out the papers with hands that trembled only slightly. "I also have personal knowledge of murder, as Judge Blackwood sentenced me to die in the Cactus Flats for discovering his crimes." Grandmother Spider-Weaver accepted the papers and studied them with surprising literacy, her lips moving silently as she read the damning evidence. Around the amphitheater, the assembled tribal representatives leaned forward in their stone seats, sensing that they were witnessing a moment of historical significance. When the old woman finally looked up from the documents, her expression had hardened into something that reminded Faith uncomfortably of Takala's controlled fury. "These papers speak truth," Grandmother Spider-Weaver announced, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the amphitheater. "The white criminals have indeed conspired to steal our land and profit from our suffering. But the question remains, what shall we do with this knowledge? Some will say we should take this evidence to the white authorities and trust in their justice. Others will say we should handle this matter ourselves, in the old way." A tall Klamath warrior rose from his seat and spoke in accented English. "The white man's justice has never protected our people, Grandmother. When have their courts ever ruled in favor of those they call savages? If we give them this evidence, they will find excuses to ignore it or explain it away. But if we take justice into our own hands," countered a Paiute chief, "they will use our actions as justification for sending more soldiers to hunt us down. We have seen this pattern before. Every act of resistance becomes an excuse for greater oppression." The debate that followed revealed the deep divisions within the tribal alliance. Some speakers advocated for armed resistance, arguing that the railroad represented an existential threat that required immediate military action. Others counseled patience and diplomacy, believing that white allies might still be found among the territorial authorities. Still others suggested a middle path, using the evidence to expose Blackwood's crimes while simultaneously preparing for the violent response that would inevitably follow. Faith listened to the discussion with growing amazement at the sophistication of the arguments being presented. These were not the primitive savages of popular imagination, but skilled politicians and military strategists who understood the complex realities of power in the American West. Their analysis of the situation was more nuanced and accurate than anything she had heard in Bitter Creek saloons or church meetings. "There is another consideration," said a voice from the back of the amphitheater. All heads turned to see a figure rising from the highest tier of stone seats, and Faith felt her blood run cold as she recognized the speaker. Joseph Crow Feather stood with the confident bearing of a man who knew he held important information. His traditional clothing, complemented by expensive boots and a silver-handled pistol that spoke of recent prosperity. Tokala's suspicions had been correct. The betrayer was here among them. "Judge Blackwood has made me an offer," Crow Feather continued, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent amphitheater. He knows that I guided his men to the hidden canyon where the white woman was hiding. He knows that I can lead them here as well, to this sacred place that has never known the tread of white boots. He paused dramatically, letting the implications sink in. He has promised me much gold and protection for my family if I deliver both the woman and her protector to his justice. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Warriors leaped to their feet, hands moving to weapons, voices raised in anger and dismay. Some called for Crowfeather's immediate execution for violating the sacred neutrality of the council ground, while others demanded to know the full extent of his betrayal. Through it all, Grandmother Spider Weaver sat motionless in her central position, watching the chaos with eyes that missed nothing. "But I have not come here to collect Blackwood's gold," Crowfeather shouted over the tumult, his voice cracking with emotion. "I have come to confess my shame and ask for the forgiveness of my people. The white judge holds my youngest son prisoner, threatens to hang him for horse theft if I do not cooperate. I thought I could serve my family by serving their enemies, but I see now that some prices are too high to pay." The revelation changed the tenor of the crowd's anger, transforming rage into something more complex and nuanced. Faith realized she was witnessing the kind of moral struggle that rarely received attention in the simplified narratives of frontier justice. Crowfeather was neither pure hero nor irredeemable villain, but a father trapped between impossible choices and trying to find a path that would protect those he loved. Tokala stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his war club. "If you led them to the canyon, brother, then you know they are only hours behind us. How long before they arrive here? How many men did Blackwood send?" 12 riders, all heavily armed," Crowfeather replied, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion and shame. "Sheriff Crockett leads them, along with 2 professional killers from San Francisco and 9 deputies who will follow orders without question. They should reach the council ground by sunset if they maintain their current pace." Grandmother Spider Weaver finally spoke, her voice cutting through the babble of angry voices like a blade through silk. "Then we have perhaps 3 hours to decide our course of action. Do we fight, knowing that violence in this sacred place will bring a curse upon all our peoples? Do we flee, abandoning our most holy ground to the boots of corrupt white men? Or do we find a third path, one that honors both our traditions and our survival?" Faith felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders as she realized that her personal struggle against injustice had somehow become the catalyst for a much larger confrontation. The decisions made in the next few hours would determine not just her own fate, but the future relationship between the tribal peoples and the encroaching forces of American expansion. And at the center of it all stood the question that had haunted the American West since the first settlers crossed the Mississippi. Was it possible for 2 radically different civilizations to coexist, or would one inevitably destroy the other? The debate that erupted following Crowfeather's confession revealed fractures within the tribal alliance that ran deeper than Faith had imagined. Warriors who had sat together in apparent unity now separated into distinct factions, each with their own vision of how to respond to the approaching threat. The Modoc representatives, led by a scarred veteran named Thunderbear, advocated for immediate armed resistance, arguing that the sacred council ground must be defended at all costs. The Klamath delegation, headed by a pragmatic chief called Winterhawk, counseled strategic withdrawal to preserve lives and fight another day. Meanwhile, the Paiute contingent remained silent, their elderly leaders stone that walks, seeming to weigh each argument with the patience of mountains. Grandmother Spider Weaver allowed the passionate discussions to continue for nearly an hour, her ancient eyes tracking each speaker with the attention of someone who understood that words spoken in anger often revealed truths that careful diplomacy would conceal. Faith found herself studying the political dynamics with fascination, recognizing patterns of alliance and opposition that reminded her of terrestrial legislature sessions she had observed back in Kansas. These tribal leaders were navigating the same complex currents of personality, tradition, and practical necessity that shaped all human governance. The white soldiers will come whether we fight or flee, Thunderbear declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced cavalry charges and lived to remember them. They have been looking for an excuse to drive us from these mountains for years. If we give them what they want without resistance, they will simply demand more. Tomorrow, better to make our stand here, in a place of power, where our ancestors can guide our weapons and strengthen our resolve. Winter Hawk shook his head grimly, the gray streaks in his braided hair catching the afternoon sunlight that slanted through the amphitheater. Brave words, brother, but fighting here means fighting surrounded, with our backs to cliffs and our only escape routes known to the enemy. If we withdraw to the hidden valleys beyond the great peaks, we can choose our ground and strike when conditions favor us rather than them. Faith realized that she was witnessing a debate that had raged across Native America for generations. Whether to resist white expansion through direct confrontation or guerrilla warfare. Each strategy had its merits and its terrible costs, and she began to understand why Tokala had seemed so burdened by the weight of decisions that offered no perfect choices. Stone That Walks finally broke his silence, rising slowly from his seat with the deliberate movements of a man whose joints carried the accumulated aches of 7 decades. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet every person in the amphitheater strained to hear his words. I have seen many battles, brothers and sisters. I have watched young warriors die for causes both just and foolish. But I have also seen that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from the strongest arm or the sharpest blade, but from the mind that sees what others cannot imagine. The old Paiute chief gestured toward Faith with one gnarled hand. This white woman brings us more than evidence of corruption. She brings us opportunity. Judge Blackwood's crimes are so brazen, so clearly documented, that even white authorities will be forced to act if the evidence is presented properly. But the presentation must be made by someone whose word cannot be dismissed as savage propaganda. Tokala stepped forward, his understanding of Stone That Walks meaning evident in his posture and expression. You are suggesting that we use Faith as our voice in the white world, that we help her reach territorial authorities who might act on her testimony. More than that, Stone That Walks replied, a crafty smile creasing his weathered features. I am suggesting that we create a situation where Judge Blackwood and his allies convict themselves through their own actions. What if the approaching riders found not a defenseless gathering of savages and a lone white woman, but something that forced them to reveal their true nature in front of witnesses who could not be silenced or ignored? The implications of the old chief's words sent a ripple of excitement through the assembled tribal representatives. Faith felt her own pulse quicken as she began to grasp the audacious scope of what was being proposed. Instead of simply reacting to Blackwood's moves, they would create a scenario that forced him to overplay his hand in front of an audience that could destroy him. Grandmother Spider Weaver leaned forward in her central seat, her eyes bright with interest. Speak plainly, old friend. What witnesses do you have in mind? And how do we ensure they see what we need them to see without placing them in mortal danger? Stone That Walks reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small object that caught the light like polished metal. Faith squinted at it, realizing with shock that it was a telegraph key, the kind used to send messages over the wire lines that were rapidly connecting the scattered settlements of the American West. My grandson works for the Territorial Telegraph Office in Flagstaff, the old chief explained with obvious pride. 3 days ago, he sent word that a federal marshal named Harrison Wade is traveling through this region, investigating reports of corruption in the territorial court system. Marshal Wade is currently in Prescott, less than a day's ride from here if he pushes his horses hard. The revelation electrified the gathering. A federal marshal represented the kind of authority that even corrupt local officials had to respect, at least publicly. If such a man could be brought to witness Judge Blackwood's crimes firsthand, the political ramifications would extend far beyond the immediate situation. But how do we contact this marshal without alerting Blackwood's men to our intentions? Winterhawk asked, voicing the practical concern that Faith was certain every person present was considering. And how do we ensure that he arrives at the right time to witness the right events? Crowfeather stepped forward hesitantly, his shame over his betrayal clearly warring with a desire to make amends. I could ride to Prescott, he offered, his voice barely audible. I know the trails, and my horse is fresh. If I leave immediately, I could reach the marshal before midnight and guide him back here by tomorrow afternoon. Thunder Bear's scarred face twisted with disgust. You would trust our fate to the man who led our enemies to us. How do we know? This is not another trap, another way to serve your white masters. Because my son's life depends on the success of this plan. Crowfeather replied with quiet dignity. If we expose Judge Blackwood's corruption completely, his power to threaten my family disappears. I have more reason than anyone to ensure that this scheme succeeds. Tokala studied Crowfeather's face with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to reading men's souls in their eyes. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. He speaks truth. A man fighting for his child's life is the most reliable ally of all, because his motivations are pure even when his methods have been flawed. Faith found herself moved by the complex dynamics of forgiveness and redemption playing out before her. In the white settlements, Crowfeather's betrayal would have marked him as permanently untrustworthy, someone to be shunned or punished regardless of his motivations. But here, among people who understood the impossible pressures of survival, in a hostile world, there was room for second chances earned through courage and sacrifice. If Crowfeather rides for the marshal, we still need a plan for dealing with Sheriff Crockett and his men when they arrive. Faith pointed out her practical mind working through the logistics of the proposed deception. They're expecting to find a helpless woman and her Indian protector hiding in the rocks. If they discover a formal tribal council with federal officials present, they might simply retreat and try again later under better circumstances. Grandmother. Spider Weaver's eyes sparkled with something that might have been amusement. Then we must give them exactly what they expect to find, child. You and Tokila will indeed be hiding in the rocks when they arrive, but not alone and not helpless. Meanwhile, the rest of us will be conducting a perfectly legitimate council session, discussing matters of tribal governance and religious observance that are clearly within our treaty rights. The plan that emerged from the next hour of intense discussion was breathtaking in its complexity and audacity. Crowfeather would ride immediately for Prescott, carrying a carefully crafted message that would bring Marshal Wade to the council ground under the pretext of investigating reports of illegal weapons trading between white criminals and tribal militants. The marshal's arrival would be timed to coincide with Sheriff Crockett's assault, creating a situation where federal authority would witness local corruption in action. Meanwhile, the tribal representatives would remain at the council ground, ostensibly continuing their religious and political discussions, while actually preparing defensive positions that could protect both themselves and the expected federal witnesses. Faith and Tokala would position themselves as obvious targets, drawing Crockett's men into revealing their true intentions, while hidden observers documented every word and action. The risk is enormous, Winterhawk warned as the details were finalized. If any element of this plan fails, we could face charges of conspiracy, terrorism, or worse. The federal government has been looking for excuses to break up the tribal alliance and force us onto smaller reservations. A failed deception could provide exactly the justification they need. The risk of doing nothing is greater, Thunder Bear countered firmly. If we allow Blackwood's corruption to continue unchecked, the railroad will bring thousands of settlers who will demand our complete removal from these lands. Better to gamble everything on exposing the truth than to slowly bleed to death through 1,000 small compromises. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Faith found herself assigned a role that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She would remain visible to the approaching riders, allowing herself to be captured or threatened in ways that would demonstrate the true nature of Blackwood's justice. The tribal warriors would be hidden in carefully prepared positions, ready to intervene if the situation became genuinely life-threatening, but committed to allowing events to unfold naturally until the critical moment. Tokala approached her as the formal council session broke up and the various tribal delegations began preparing for the coming confrontation. His expression was serious but not grim, carrying the focused intensity of a professional warrior preparing for battle. "Are you certain you want to do this, Faith Sterling? Once we begin, there will be no turning back. Sheriff Crockett is not a man who shows mercy to those who defy him." Faith looked around the ancient amphitheater, taking in the sight of dozens of Native American warriors making ready to risk everything for a chance at justice. These people owed her nothing, yet they were willing to gamble their freedom and their lives on a plan that might expose the corruption threatening all their futures. How could she do less? "Your sister died fighting for what was right," she said quietly. "My husband died the same way. If I'm going to honor their memory, I can't do it by running and hiding when the moment of truth arrives." As the tribal representatives dispersed to their assigned positions, Faith noticed something that filled her with both hope and terror. The warriors were not simply preparing to fight, but to win. Every movement was purposeful and coordinated. Every weapon was checked and rechecked. Every escape route was marked and memorized. These were not desperate people making a last stand, but skilled professionals executing a carefully planned operation. The arrival of an unexpected visitor added a new wrinkle to the developing situation. As Faith and Tokala settled into their designated hiding place among the rocks overlooking the main trail, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the council ground from the east rather than the south where Crockett's party was expected. Through Tokala's telescope, Faith could make out a woman riding side saddle, her dark dress and proper bonnet, marking her as a respectable member of white society. "I know that horse," Tokala murmured, his voice tight with surprise. "It belongs to Dr. Margaret Whitmore, the physician who treats both white settlers and tribal members in the valley settlements. But what brings her here at such a dangerous time?" Dr. Whitmore's arrival at the council ground created an immediate stir among the hidden tribal warriors. The middle-aged physician was known and respected throughout the territory for her willingness to treat anyone regardless of race or ability to pay. But her presence here complicated the carefully orchestrated plan. If shooting started, an innocent white woman could be caught in the crossfire, creating exactly the kind of incident that would justify massive military retaliation. Grandmother Spiderweaver emerged from her concealed position to greet the unexpected visitor, her expression betraying none of the tension that must have been churning in her ancient heart. The conversation between the two women was brief but animated, conducted in whispers that carried urgency if not actual alarm. After a few minutes, Dr. Whitmore remounted her horse and rode directly toward Faith and Tokala's hiding place. "Miss Sterling," the doctor called softly as she approached their rocky shelter. "I bring word from Murphy O'Connell and others in Bitter Creek who remain loyal to justice rather than profit. Judge Blackwood has declared you dead, killed while resisting arrest in the desert. He plans to use your supposed death as justification for a military expedition against hostile Indians who allegedly murdered a white woman under federal protection." The implications hit Faith like a physical blow. Blackwood wasn't just trying to silence her testimony. He was planning to use her elimination as the spark for a larger conflict that would clear the tribal peoples from the entire region. The land grab was even more ambitious than she had imagined, encompassing not just railroad profits, but the complete restructuring of territorial ownership. "There's more," Dr. Whitmore continued, her voice heavy with grim news. "Marshal Wade never reached Prescott. His party was attacked by unknown assailants 2 days ago. The marshal survived, but is badly wounded and unable to travel. The federal government has been told that he was attacked by tribal raiders, and cavalry units are already being dispatched to restore order. Faith felt the carefully constructed plan crumbling around her like a house built on sand. Without federal oversight, any confrontation with Sheriff Crockett would be portrayed exactly as Blackwood intended: savage Indians murdering innocent white officials who were simply trying to maintain law and order. The trap that they had hoped to spring on their enemies had become a trap that would destroy them all. The sound of approaching horses reached the council ground, just as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the ancient amphitheater in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to prophesy bloodshed. Faith pressed herself deeper into the rocky crevice where she and Tokala had taken shelter, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Sheriff Crockett's posse emerge from the trail below. 12 riders, exactly as Crow Feather had reported. But their formation and equipment revealed a level of military precision that spoke of careful planning rather than hasty pursuit. These weren't just local lawmen chasing a fugitive. They were a strike force assembled to eliminate specific targets with maximum efficiency. Dr. Whitmore had withdrawn to a position near Grandmother Spider Weaver's ceremonial seat, her medical bag prominently displayed to establish her neutral status as a healer. The tribal warriors had melted into the rocks and shadows with such skill that Faith could no longer detect their presence, despite knowing their approximate positions. Only the faintest glint of metal or flash of movement betrayed that the amphitheater was anything other than an ancient ruin occupied by an old woman, a visiting doctor, and whatever wildlife called the sacred mountain home. Sheriff Crockett rode at the head of his column with the confident bearing of a man who expected easy victory. His lean frame sat straight in the saddle, gray eyes scanning the terrain with professional thoroughness, while his right hand rested casually on the butt of his holstered pistol. Behind him rode Deputy Marshal Kane, a thick-set man whose badge gleamed silver in the fading light, followed by the 2 professional gunmen Faith had glimpsed earlier. The remaining 8 riders were a mixture of local deputies and hired guns, all armed with military surplus rifles and the kind of grim determination that came from knowing their employer paid well for results. "Spread out and check every rock pile," Crockett commanded as his men reached the amphitheater floor. "Sterling and her Indian protector are here somewhere, probably holed up like rats in whatever cave they could find. Remember, Judge Blackwood wants them both taken alive if possible, but don't take unnecessary risks. Dead martyrs can't testify about things they shouldn't have seen." Faith felt Tokala tense beside her as the import of Crockett's words became clear. The sheriff wasn't here to arrest fugitives. He was here to eliminate witnesses whose testimony could destroy the entire land grab conspiracy. Judge Blackwood had abandoned any pretense of legal process in favor of simple murder disguised as law enforcement. The realization sent a chill through Faith's bones that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The search proceeded with methodical efficiency that revealed extensive training in manhunt tactics. The hired gunmen worked in pairs, covering each other as they cleared potential hiding spots with military precision. One of them, a scarred individual with dead eyes and clothes that suggested recent prosperity, carried a repeating rifle that could unleash devastating firepower in seconds. His companion was smaller, but moved with the fluid grace of someone who had survived multiple gunfights through speed and cunning rather than brute force. As the searchers spread throughout the amphitheater, Faith noticed details that revealed the true scope of Blackwood's corruption. Several of the deputies wore new boots and carried expensive weapons that no honest lawman could afford on territorial wages. Their horses were better fed and equipped than any sheriff's department could justify, suggesting that money was flowing freely from sources that preferred to remain anonymous. These men weren't just following orders. They were investors in a criminal enterprise that promised enormous returns. Marshal Kane, Crockett called to his second-in-command as the search expanded toward the upper tiers of the amphitheater. "Take 3 men and check those rock formations near the spring. If they're getting water from somewhere, that's where. We'll find them. The rest of you, keep your eyes open for Indian sign. Where there's one, there's usually more." Deputy Marshal Kane's response was interrupted by the clear, strong voice of Grandmother Spider Weaver as she rose from her ceremonial seat near the central pool. The ancient woman moved with dignity. That commanded attention, her silver hair catching the last rays of sunlight like a crown of starlight. "You are welcome in this sacred place, white lawmen, if you come in peace and respect the ancient treaties that protect these grounds. But if you come seeking violence, you will find that the mountains themselves will turn against you." The effect of her words on Crockett's men was immediate and revealing. Several of the local deputies shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of violating a recognized sacred site. These were men who lived in the territory, who understood that certain boundaries shouldn't be crossed regardless of orders. But the professional gunmen showed no such hesitation, their weapons swinging toward the elderly woman with casual readiness. To kill, the contrast between local law enforcement and imported killers couldn't have been more stark. "Ma'am," Sheriff Crockett said with exaggerated politeness, dismounting and approaching the ancient woman with his hat in his hands. His voice carried the false courtesy of a predator playing with prey, each word calculated to maintain his facade of legitimacy. "I'm Sheriff Randall Crockett of Bitter Creek, and I'm pursuing 2 dangerous fugitives who are wanted for theft, murder, and inciting Indian uprising. A white woman named Faith Sterling and a Modoc brave called Tokola. I have reason to believe they're hiding somewhere on this mountain." Grandmother Spider Weaver studied the sheriff with eyes that seemed to see through his flesh to the corruption beneath. Her weathered face remained impassive, but Faith could sense the ancient wisdom working behind those dark eyes, calculating threats and opportunities with the patience of centuries. "I know of no such people, lawman. Only the spirits of my ancestors dwell on this mountain, and they do not welcome those who come with lies on their lips and murder in their hearts." The old woman's words struck home with devastating accuracy. Crockett's mask of professional courtesy slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation underneath. His jaw tightened, and his eyes hardened as he realized that this elderly Indian wasn't going to be intimidated by his badge or his armed men. "Now see here, Grandmother, I'm not asking your permission. I have legal authority to search these premises and arrest anyone who interferes with my duties." "Whose authority?" Dr. Whitmore asked suddenly, rising from her own position and approaching with her medical bag held prominently before her. The physician moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being respected, her crisp white blouse and professional demeanor contrasting sharply with the rough frontier clothing of Crockett's men. "I am Dr. Margaret Whitmore, licensed physician for this territory, and I was not aware that local sheriffs had jurisdiction over federal treaty lands. Perhaps you could show me the warrant that authorizes your presence here." Faith watched in fascination as Dr. Whitmore's intervention changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The physician's presence as a witness meant that everything happening here would be reported to territorial authorities, regardless of the outcome. Sheriff Crockett found himself in the position of having to justify his actions to someone whose word would be believed in territorial courts, someone whose medical training gave her the authority to question official statements about cause of death. "Doctor, this is a matter of public safety," Crockett replied, his voice taking on a harder edge as he realized the complications her presence created. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool mountain air, and his right hand drifted unconsciously toward his weapon. "The fugitives we're pursuing have already killed 3 people and are believed to be planning attacks on innocent settlers. I don't need a warrant to pursue murderers into Indian territory." "3 murders?" Dr. Whitmore asked with professional skepticism that cut through Crockett's lies like a surgical blade. Her medical training had taught her to observe details that others missed, and she was clearly noting the inconsistencies in the sheriff's story. "That's curious, Sheriff, because I examined the supposed victims of Faith Sterling's alleged crimes, and they all appeared to have died from natural causes. In fact, the only suspicious death I've documented recently was that of Mrs. Helena Vasquez, who died after receiving medication that was ordered by Judge Blackwood himself, the physicians." Words hit the assembled lawmen like thunderbolts. Several of the local deputies exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly hearing details about Judge Blackwood's activities that they hadn't been told. Faith could see doubt creeping into their faces as they began to question whether they were enforcing justice or participating in a cover-up. The professional gunmen remained impassive, but their hands shifted closer to their weapons as the situation grew more volatile. Sheriff Crockett's facade finally cracked completely, revealing the desperate criminal underneath. His face flushed red with anger and fear as he realized that his carefully planned operation was unraveling before his eyes. "Doctor, you're interfering with official business. I'm going to have to ask you to leave this area immediately for your own safety. Are you threatening a licensed physician in the performance of her duties?" Dr. Whitmore asked calmly, but her voice carried clearly across the amphitheater. Every word was chosen with precision, designed to create a legal record that would be impossible to explain away later. Because such threats would constitute a federal crime, punishable by imprisonment and loss of all territorial authority. The tension in the air became almost unbearable as both sides maneuvered for advantage, in a confrontation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. Faith realized that the moment of truth was approaching, the instant when words would give way to violence and the carefully planned deception would either succeed brilliantly or fail catastrophically. She felt Tokala's hand on her shoulder, a silent reminder that whatever happened next, they would face it together. One of the professional gunmen, a lean man with cold eyes and a silver-handled pistol, stepped forward with the lazy confidence of someone who had solved similar problems many times before. "Sheriff, maybe it's time we stopped talking and started doing what we came here to do. The doctor can write all the reports she wants after we're finished." The threat was unmistakable, and it galvanized everyone present. Dr. Whitmore stepped back toward Grandmother Spider Weaver's position, her medical training telling her to seek cover when violence became inevitable. The local deputies looked increasingly uncomfortable, torn between loyalty to their sheriff and reluctance to participate in what was clearly becoming murder rather than law enforcement. The first shot came without warning, fired by the silver pistol. Gunmen who had apparently decided that Dr. Whitmore represented an unacceptable threat to their mission. The bullet struck the rocks near the physician's feet, sending stone fragments flying and causing her to stumble backward toward Grandmother Spider Weaver's position. The message was clear: leave now or face the consequences, but the gunman had made a fatal miscalculation. The moment his weapon discharged, the hidden tribal warriors revealed themselves with devastating effect. War cries echoed off the canyon walls as painted figures emerged from concealment, some armed with traditional weapons, others carrying modern rifles that spoke of extensive contact with white traders. The amphitheater, which had seemed empty moments before, suddenly swarmed with deadly efficient fighters who had every advantage of position and preparation. Thunder Bear materialized from the rocks above Sheriff Crockett like an avenging spirit, his painted face a mask of controlled fury as he dropped down behind the mounted lawman. His rifle barrel pressed against Crockett's spine before the sheriff could react, and his voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had fought in real battles. "Drop your weapon, white man, or I'll drop you where you sit." Around the amphitheater, similar scenes played out as Crockett's men discovered that they were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely at the mercy of opponents who understood the terrain far better than they did. Winterhawk's Klamath warriors had positioned themselves to control the main escape routes, while Stone That Walks Paiute fighters commanded the high ground from concealed positions among the ancient stone seats. "Nobody move." Thunder Bear commanded in English that carried only the faintest trace of accent. His rifle never wavered from Crockett's back as he addressed the assembled gunmen. "Drop your weapons and you might live to see another sunrise. Resist and you'll die where you stand." The professional gunmen proved their worth by immediately complying with the order, recognizing a hopeless tactical situation when they saw one. They had been hired to eliminate specific targets under controlled conditions, not to fight a pitched battle against superior numbers in unfamiliar terrain. But several of the local deputies seemed frozen with indecision, unsure whether to surrender to savages or fight their way out of what had become an obvious trap. Deputy Marshal Kane made the decision for them by dropping his rifle and raising his hands, his practical mind recognizing that survival was more important than pride. "Do what he says, boys," Kane called to the other deputies. "This ain't our fight anymore." Faith and Tokala emerged from their hiding place as the immediate danger passed. Faith marveling at the speed and precision with which the tribal warriors had reversed the situation. In less than 30 seconds, a hunting party had become prisoners, their weapons confiscated, and their freedom entirely dependent on the mercy of people they had come to destroy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. "Sheriff Crockett," Faith said as she approached the disarmed lawman, her voice carrying a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The fear that had dominated her life for weeks was finally giving way to the satisfaction of seeing justice served. "You came here to murder me on Judge Blackwood's orders, but instead you're going to help me expose the corruption that's poisoned this entire territory. Dr. Whitmore, I believe you'll want to document everything Sheriff Crockett tells us about the land grab conspiracy." But before Crockett could respond, the sound of additional horses approaching from the main trail sent fresh tension through the assembled crowd. Faith felt her heart sink as she realized that their victory might be short-lived if Blackwood had sent reinforcements. The tribal warriors immediately shifted to new defensive positions, their weapons trained on the trail entrance as they prepared for another fight. However, the riders who appeared at the mouth of the amphitheater were not additional gunmen, but something far more significant. A column of blue uniformed cavalry led by an officer whose bearing spoke of significant rank and authority. The sight of federal troops sent a mixture of relief and apprehension through the gathered crowd, as everyone present understood that the arrival of the military would fundamentally change the nature of their confrontation. The lead rider was a colonel by his insignia, a weathered man in his 50s whose gray mustache and steady eyes suggested extensive frontier experience. Behind him rode a full troop of cavalry, their weapons ready but not drawn, their formation suggesting professional military discipline rather than the casual brutality of hired guns. Most importantly, riding beside the colonel was a figure that made Faith's knees weak with relief. Federal Marshal Harrison Wade, wounded but alive, his left arm in a sling but his authority intact. "I am Colonel James Morrison of the Territorial Cavalry," the lead officer announced as his men spread out to secure the amphitheater. His voice carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, and his eyes took in the scene before him with the trained assessment of a professional soldier. "We received reports of illegal military action against treaty-protected tribal lands and came to investigate. Marshal Wade here has some very interesting things to tell us about corruption in the territorial court system." Sheriff Crockett's face went ashen as he realized that his carefully planned operation had become a disaster of epic proportions. Not only had he failed to eliminate Faith Sterling and her evidence, but he had been caught in the act of violating federal law by a senior military officer and a federal marshal. The land grab conspiracy was about to be exposed at the highest levels of territorial government. Marshal Wade dismounted carefully from his cavalry horse, favoring his injured arm, but moving with the determined gait of a federal officer who had traveled far to ensure justice was served. His weathered face bore the marks of recent violence, a bandage visible beneath his hat where the ambush had left its mark, but his eyes burned with the righteous fury of a lawman who had seen corruption flourish unchecked for too long. The sight of Sheriff Crockett surrounded by tribal warriors with weapons drawn brought a grim smile to his lips, as if he were witnessing the inevitable conclusion to a long and complex investigation. "Sheriff Crockett," Marshal Wade said in a voice that carried absolute federal authority across the ancient amphitheater, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, violation of federal treaty rights, and participation in a criminal enterprise designed to defraud the United States government. Your employer, Judge Cornelius Blackwood, is also wanted on charges of corruption, fraud, and multiple counts of murder in the first degree." The words struck the assembled crowd like lightning, confirming what many had suspected, but few had dared to voice openly. Colonel Morrison dismounted and approached the central area where prisoners and captors faced each other in an uneasy standoff, his military bearing commanding immediate respect from all present. The cavalry troopers remained mounted but alert, their disciplined silence speaking volumes about their readiness to enforce federal law, regardless of local political considerations. Faith felt a surge of vindication so powerful it made her knees weak as she realized that her desperate flight through the Cactus Flats had led not to her death as Blackwood intended, but to the complete exposure of a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of territorial governance. The evidence she had carried from the Silver Dollar Saloon, stained with her own blood and nearly lost a dozen times, would finally see the light of justice in a federal courtroom where money and local influence meant nothing. "Marshal Wade," Dr. Whitmore called out, stepping forward with her medical bag and the authoritative bearing of someone whose professional credentials opened doors throughout the territory. "I have documented evidence of systematic poisoning of elderly patients at Bitter Creek General Hospital, all connected to insurance fraud schemes operated by Judge Blackwood and his associates. The medical records will provide irrefutable proof of premeditated murder, disguised as natural death." Thunder Bear slowly lowered his rifle from Sheriff Crockett's back, allowing the disgraced lawman to dismount under the watchful eyes of federal cavalry. The Modoc warrior's painted face remained impassive, but Faith could see satisfaction in his dark eyes as he witnessed the moment when white justice finally aligned with tribal concepts of accountability. For too long, corrupt officials had hidden behind badges and legal technicalities, while innocent people suffered. Now the reckoning had arrived, Colonel Morrison, Grandmother Spider Weaver said, rising from her ceremonial seat with the dignity of someone who had witnessed 8 decades of change in the American West. "This sacred ground has seen much violence today, but it has also seen the triumph of truth over lies, justice over corruption. The Great Spirit smiles when the innocent are protected and the guilty are brought to account, regardless of the color of their skin or the nature of their authority." The ancient woman's words carried a spiritual weight that seemed to settle over the entire amphitheater like a benediction. Even the hardened cavalry troopers felt the power of the moment, understanding that they were witnessing something larger than a simple arrest. This was a convergence of cultures and legal systems, a rare instance where federal law, tribal justice, and moral righteousness all pointed in the same direction. Colonel Morrison nodded respectfully to Grandmother Spider Weaver before turning his attention to the practical matters of securing prisoners and evidence. "Sergeant McKenna," he called to his senior non-commissioned officer, "place Sheriff Crockett and his men under close arrest. Full shackles for the sheriff and the professional gunmen. Restraints for the deputies pending investigation of their individual involvement. Dr. Whitmore, I'll need you to provide written testimony about the medical evidence you mentioned." As the cavalry troopers moved to secure the prisoners, Faith found herself face to face with Sheriff Crockett for the first time since he had pointed her toward the Cactus Flats and told her to start walking. The man who had seemed so powerful and threatening just days ago now appeared diminished and desperate, his authority stripped away along with his weapons. The gray eyes that had been so cold and calculating now held only the fear of a criminal who understood that his crimes had finally caught up with him. "You don't know what you've done," Crockett said to Faith, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the venom of a man who blamed others for his own failures. "Blackwood has connections all the way to Washington. Federal marshals can be bought just like local sheriffs. You think this is over, but it's just beginning. There are bigger players in this game than you can imagine." Marshal Wade stepped closer, his wounded arm not preventing him from projecting the full authority of federal law enforcement. "Sheriff, I suggest you save your breath for your testimony before the federal grand jury. The corruption investigation has been ongoing for 8 months, and we have documented evidence of the conspiracy reaching far beyond this territory. Your cooperation might earn you life in prison instead of a rope around your neck." The revelation that federal authorities had been investigating the corruption for months sent ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. Faith realized that her discovery of the fraudulent bookkeeping had been just one piece of a much larger puzzle, that investigators had been quietly building a case against the entire network of corrupt officials and businessmen. Her desperate flight had inadvertently provided the final evidence needed to bring down the conspiracy. Tokala approached Faith as the prisoners were being secured, his lean frame moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating dangerous situations. The Modoc hunter's dark eyes held a mixture of satisfaction and concern as he studied her face, reading the emotional exhaustion that was finally beginning to show now that the immediate danger had passed. "It is finished, Faith Sterling," he said quietly, his accented English carrying the weight of ritual pronouncement. "Your courage has brought justice not just for yourself, but for all the innocent people who suffered under Blackwood's corruption." Faith felt tears she hadn't known she was holding back begin to flow down her dusty cheeks as the full impact of their victory settled into her consciousness. The nightmare that had begun with her discovery of suspicious financial records was finally ending, not with her death in the desert as Blackwood had planned, but with the complete destruction of his criminal empire. The price had been enormous weeks of terror, physical agony, and the constant fear of death, but justice had prevailed. Dr. Whitmore approached with her medical bag, her professional concern overriding the dramatic events unfolding around them. "Miss Sterling, you need proper medical attention for those foot wounds, and I suspect you're suffering from dehydration and exhaustion that could have serious long-term consequences. Colonel Morrison, I request permission to establish a field hospital here to treat the injured before we attempt to transport anyone." Colonel Morrison nodded his approval, understanding that medical care took precedence over administrative convenience. "Set up whatever you need, Doctor. We'll make camp here tonight and transport the prisoners to Prescott in the morning. That will give everyone time to recover and provide proper statements about what happened here." As Dr. Whitmore began treating Faith's injuries with professional efficiency, the full scope of the conspiracy's collapse became apparent. Deputy Marshal Kane, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of federal prosecution, began providing detailed information about Blackwood's operations in exchange for leniency. The professional gunmen remained silent, but their expensive equipment and recent prosperity spoke volumes about the resources that had been devoted to silencing inconvenient witnesses. Judge Blackwood maintained detailed records of all his transactions, Kane revealed as he sat shackled near the central pool, his voice carrying the defeated tone of a man who understood that cooperation was his only hope for survival. Names, dates, amounts paid, services rendered. He kept everything in a safe behind his law books, thinking that no one would dare search a judge's private chambers. "If you can get those documents, you'll have enough evidence to prosecute half the territorial government." Marshal Wade's eyes lit up with professional satisfaction as he realized the implications of Kane's revelation. A corrupt judge's private records would provide the kind of comprehensive evidence that could transform a complex conspiracy case into a series of straightforward prosecutions. "Sergeant Patterson," he called to one of the cavalry troopers, "take a squad and ride hard for Bitter Creek. I want Judge Blackwood's chambers sealed and searched before anyone has a chance to destroy evidence." As evening settled over the key, sacred amphitheater, an unexpected sense of peace descended over the diverse group that had gathered to witness justice being served. Federal cavalry troopers shared their rations with tribal warriors who had been their enemies just hours before, while Dr. Whitmore moved between patients regardless of race or allegiance. The artificial barriers that usually separated people in the American West seemed to dissolve in the face of shared moral purpose. Grandmother Spiderweaver approached Faith as the young woman rested beside the central pool, her feet finally properly bandaged and her body beginning to recover from the ordeal of the past weeks. The ancient woman's weathered face held an expression of deep satisfaction, as if she had witnessed the fulfillment of some long-awaited prophecy. "You have walked through fire and emerged stronger, white daughter," she said in English that carried the formal cadence of ceremonial speech. "The spirits of this sacred place have accepted your sacrifice and blessed your courage." Faith looked around the amphitheater, taking in the sight of former enemies sharing food and stories around small campfires, while federal prisoners sat under guard nearby. The scene seemed impossible, a vision of what the American West might become if justice and cooperation could triumph over greed and racial hatred. "I couldn't have done any of this alone," she replied, her voice still hoarse from the desert ordeal but growing stronger with each word. "Tokala saved my life. You provided sanctuary. Dr. Whitmore risked everything to bear witness. This victory belongs to all of us." Tokala joined them by the pool, his weapons finally set aside now that the immediate danger had passed. The Modoc hunter had removed his war paint, revealing features that spoke of intelligence and compassion beneath the warrior's mask. "My sister Ayana died fighting this same corruption in a different place," he said quietly, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Today, her spirit can finally rest knowing that such crimes do not go unpunished forever." Colonel Morrison approached their small group, his military bearings softened by the remarkable events he had witnessed. "Miss Sterling, Marshal Wade has asked me to inform you that the federal government will require your testimony in multiple court proceedings, but that you'll be provided with protection and compensation for your cooperation. The evidence you discovered will be crucial in prosecuting not just Blackwood and his immediate associates, but the larger network of corruption they were part of." The prospect of extended legal proceedings felt overwhelming to Faith after everything she had endured, but she understood that her responsibility to justice didn't end with Blackwood's arrest. How many other people were harmed by this conspiracy, Colonel? How many families lost loved ones to Blackwood's greed? "We estimate at least 47 suspicious deaths across 5 different communities," Colonel Morrison replied grimly, his professional composure unable to entirely mask his disgust at the scope of the crimes. "Your courage in exposing the fraud may have saved dozens of additional lives by stopping the conspiracy before it could expand further." As the night deepened and the campfires burned lower, Faith found herself contemplating a future that seemed both uncertain and full of possibility. The woman who had walked barefoot into the Cactus Flats, expecting to die, was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required fighting for principles larger than personal safety. She had discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed, and forged alliances that transcended the racial and cultural boundaries that usually divided the American frontier. Dr. Whitmore approached with a final medical assessment, her professional manner warm with genuine concern for her patient's welfare. "Your physical injuries will heal completely with proper care, Miss Sterling, but I'm more concerned about the psychological impact of what you've endured. Have you given any thought to what you'll do once the legal proceedings are concluded?" Faith looked across the amphitheater at Tokala, who was engaged in quiet conversation with Thunderbear and several other tribal warriors, the Modoc hunter. had risked everything to save her life, asking nothing in return except the chance to honor his sister's memory through action. Their partnership had been forged in crisis, but she sensed that it could evolve into something deeper and more lasting if they both chose to pursue that possibility. "I think I'll stay in the territory," Faith said finally, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even her. "There's work to be done here, corruption to be rooted out, bridges to be built between communities that have been taught to hate each other. The railroad will come eventually, bringing change whether we're ready for it or not. Maybe I can help ensure that the change serves justice rather than greed." 3 months later, Faith Sterling stood in the doorway of her new office in Prescott, reading the brass nameplate that identified her as the Territorial Inspector of Medical Facilities, a position created specifically to prevent the kind of systematic patient abuse that Judge Blackwood had orchestrated. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman he had tried to kill in the desert had become the government official responsible for investigating medical corruption throughout the territory. Tokali emerged from the inner office where he had been, reviewing case files in his capacity as her official liaison with tribal communities. The former hunter had adapted to his new role with the same quiet competence he had shown in the wilderness, proving equally skilled at navigating political complexities and bureaucratic challenges. Their professional partnership had indeed evolved into something deeper, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. "The Blackwood trial concluded this morning," Tokala reported, his English now completely fluid after months of immersion in legal proceedings. Life imprisonment for the judge, 15 years for Sheriff Crockett, various sentences for the other conspirators. Harrison Blackthorne lost his railroad contracts. Augustus Grimm was stripped of his grazing rights, and Silas Forge's mining claims were revoked. The Desert Development Company has been dissolved, and its assets distributed as compensation to the victims' families. Faith nodded with satisfaction, understanding that justice had been served as completely as the legal system allowed. The corruption that had poisoned the territory for years had been exposed and punished, creating space for more honest development of the region's resources. The railroad would still come, but under federal oversight that protected both tribal rights and individual settlers from exploitation. As they walked together through Prescott's busy streets, Faith reflected on the journey that had brought her from near death in the Cactus flats to a position of influence and respect in territorial government. The barefoot woman who had stumbled through the thorns seemed like a different person now, someone whose courage and determination had been forged in the crucible of absolute desperation. She had learned that sometimes the most profound changes came not from grand gestures, but from ordinary people refusing to accept injustice even when resistance seemed hopeless. The desert wind that had once carried the promise of death now brought the scent of sage and possibility, reminding Faith that the American West remained a place where individuals could shape their own destinies through courage, determination, and the willingness to fight for what was right. Her story had begun with corruption and nearly ended with murder, but it had concluded with justice triumphant and a future full of hope.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.